So welcome, madam, to the official Umbraco Users Group of India meetup, and thank you for joining us and presenting about Astro with Umbraco. So yeah, please uh,
Oh,
start
okay.
with your.
Oh,
Yeah.
yep. Just give me like 1 second, maybe
Sure.
1 minute while I just get everything on my windows in the right place. Okay. So I'm just going to share my screen. Give me a thumbs up if you can see that, Nicole.
Yeah, lovely. I can see it here.
Perfect. And hopefully there we go. Perfect. So yeah, thanks everyone for having me at the India meetup. This is a talk that I've given a couple of times over the last sort of back to Code Garden actually, so probably up to 8 months now. And it's my first time giving this talk virtually, which is going to be an interesting experience for me. I've given it a few meetups and US Fest and Code Garden, and there's going to be a very subtle bakery theme for this talk. And when I was giving it in person, what I like to do is wherever town I went to, I chose a local delicacy for baked good and tried to get that organized to be delivered for the end of the meetup. But sadly, because we're virtual, I can't do that today. But if I was going to be with you today, it would be if this will change slide, the Namkatai, which I am recommended by Abby, is a wonderful baked good that everyone would enjoy. But if I was there in person with you today, imagine us going to the bakery for this amazing, it looks absolutely stunning. But the bakery might turn around and say, just give us a second. We've not got the ingredients in place. We've not kneaded our Nankatai dough. And we've not even fired the ovens up yet. And imagine they did this over and over again for every single customer that came in. It would be frustrating and just a tad wasteful, I'm sure you'll agree. But what on earth is Adam doing talking about baked goods at a tech meetup? Well, imagine this scenario and imagine how a server might serve web content to our users. The user comes along and just wants the content, all of that sweet HTML and CSS. But instead of being provided it straight back, the server goes, give me a sec. Well, I speak to some APIs, some databases, maybe some other servers thrown into the mix for good measure, before eventually returning back with that content, and goes through this same laborious process for each request that comes in, and it's really tedious. So hello everyone, my name is Adam, and today we're going to look at an alternative way of building and serving websites as we look at static site generation and how we can embrace the principle of bake, don't fry. So that's pre-baking our content as static HTML instead of dynamically frying up requests each time they come in. So what we're going to look at today, we're actually going to spotlight a specific static site generation tool called Astro. So Astro has been making many waves in the development community over the past few years and is becoming increasingly popular. We'll look at what Astro is and how we can get up and running from a basic Hello World type example, all the way through to integrating Umbraco's content delivery API for a CMS powered static site. We'll also touch upon some hosting options for Astro, and you could also use those for other static site generation tools. And we'll also look at how we can keep our content fresh when our editors are busy publishing. But first of all, what on earth is Astro? Well, Astro was created by Fred Kayshott and Nate Moore and a team of open source engineers that saw an opportunity to rethink the way that meta frameworks and static site generation tools operate. Its core differentiation compared to sort of other approaches, it really sort of focuses on content-driven sites. So On one end of the spectrum, this could be things we might traditionally think of with static site generation, so blogs and stuff like that, which a lot of tools like Jekyll and Gatsby were originally focused on. But actually Astro takes that to the next level and has more of a focus on large content sites and trying to optimize for really heavy brochureware and marketing sites. And these are often the sites we build with Umbraco, which in my opinion makes Astro a fantastic headless partner for Umbraco. It's also fully open source, got a rich community dedicating to improving the developer experience, managing pull requests, PRs, all of that stuff, and generally keeping that community buoyant and active. And for those of us involved in the Umbraco community, we'll see a lot of synergy and familiarity with that. From a technical standpoint, its core differentiation from other meta frameworks out there like Next, which I mentioned a bit earlier, and Nuxt, if you've ever done Vue development, is that it delivers zero JavaScript down to the browser by default. And this is what gives it a superpower in terms of fast performance. So I said it was going to be bakery themed, and this is where we roll our sleeves up and enter our Astro bakery for today. And we're going to firstly look at how we can bake a really simple static site with Astro. And this will just get us familiar with some of the syntax that Astro has, and start off with something simple before we bring Umbraco into the mix. So first of all, we need to install Astro. So the installation process could not be any simpler for a developer anyway. All we have to do from the command line is run npm create astro at latest. That will go away, install all of our dependencies we need, and set up everything on disk we need to get up and running in no time at all. Some of the directories that this will create and you would generally be working with on a day-to-day basis are these. So pages, layouts, and components. So pages is where all of our Astro page files will live, and we'll see what those look like very shortly. Layouts is where our common HTML will live, so it's your templates, essentially very similar to the template idea in Umbraco and .NET. And then components is going to be all of our widgets, all of our blocks, whatever, very similar to Vue components from .NET. Now I'm going to call out specifically some functionality of the pages directory, because it has a bit of a superpower in a way, because it is responsible by default for the routing of the application. So if you create files, so Astro pages within the pages directory, those have a corresponding effect on the root for the application. So an index file at the root there will resolve to the root URL for the site, and then creating further files or directories in there will have a corresponding effect on the URL. So a blog subdirectory with an index file in it would resolve to /blog, and then you can see at the bottom there, if you name the file, for instance, article.astro, that will have a corresponding effect in the URL name. Now that's the default behavior with Astro, and I'm going to put a pin in the routing for now, and we'll return to it and evolve it slightly to make it work better with Umbraco shortly. Before we do that though, what I'm going to do is, you see that index.astro file at the top? Let's pretend we're building like a single home page. So how can we get up and running with that and do it in a hello world type fashion? Let's open that index.astro file. We're going to get familiar with some of the unique syntax of Astro within here, but I'll keep it really simple. So at the top there, we're going to import a layout from our common layout. Imagine that's got all of your common HTML in there, and we're just going to inject into the body tag. We'll then use that layout, and then we'll just add a h1 hello from Astro. It couldn't be any simpler, right? The reason I've kept it this simple is I want to call out in blue at the top there, if that's coming okay over the screen share, the bit at the top with the triple dash, and that's called in Astro the component script. And it uses the triple dash code fence to segment the page script from the markup. So within that component script at the top, we can actually put whatever JavaScript we want in there. And you'll see how we can leverage that as we go forward. And that will be used at build time to generate our static assets for us, our static files. If you've seen this and it looks familiar, you may have seen, like in Markdown, the concept of front matter, where you can put metadata at the start of a Markdown file with the triple dash. That is actually where the Astro team got their inspiration for this. But in practice, very different, because you can put JavaScript in here. So before we sort of evolve that, and let's look at our next ingredient. So this is an Umbraco meetup. So we want to bring Umbraco into the mix at some point. So what can we use from Umbraco to simply build an Astro site with? And that next ingredient is going to be the content delivery API from Umbraco. For those of you who are not familiar with it, it was introduced in version 12 of the core product and brings headless functionality natively to the core product. Whereas before, if you wanted to work headlessly with an install of Umbraco, you'd have to build your custom APIs. So it's a REST API, incredibly rich, brings back a vast quantity of information back. If you can imagine a large application with block lists, block grid, the amount of you get back in that response can be quite overwhelming. And there's ways of handling that to make it a bit easier, which we'll touch upon in a bit. The REST API, there's lots of different ways of querying it and filtering it down to make it more manageable. For more advanced ways on doing that, I will refer you to the fantastic documentation that's available. For today's talk, to keep those touch points simple to allow us to understand them, we're going to focus on two different types of endpoint. So firstly, there's a base URL to consider for the delivery API, /Umbraco/delivery/API, then the version, and we're currently on version 2. I don't see that changing in the foreseeable future at the moment anyway. Then the two endpoints we're going to look at today. Want to get a single item of content back, which is /content/item, and then you provide a path. So that's the same as you would provide a path in the URL structure. So no path would get the root node, often the home page for the application, and then the desired path, just the same as you would do in a browser. And then an endpoint to get multiple items of content back, and that's known as the query endpoint. And that's just a /content. And there's lots of different query strings you can put on there to filter it down. I'll touch upon those when we get to it. So let's now bake building our next ingredient, the content delivery API, into our mixture. All good developers, we like to iterate, right? So let's return to our original Hello World example. So it's just a home page at the moment. And let's start building on top of this and trying to build in Umbraco into the mix. Now the component script at the top there, I said any JavaScript can go in there. So within here, we can do a good old-fashioned JavaScript fetch request. So we're going to do that to the endpoint to get a single item back, the home page in this instance. Notice in the actual code, I'm not providing a path after item, so that we get the root node. In reality, in your systems, obviously host, where it's in the braces there, you would manage that, could come from config, etc. So a good old-fashioned JavaScript fetch request. And then what we can do is set a variable up here called page, and I'm just going to await and get the JSON response back from that JavaScript fetch request. So now we've got all of the JSON in our component script. Now, this next step is where the beauty of the simplicity of this integration comes into effect, because what we can do is simply in the markup below, reference that page property and then call the properties which have come back from Umbraco directly in the Astro file. So within the response from the content delivery API, any custom properties would be on .properties and then the name, the alias of the property. So for example, we might have a title on that document type, subtitle, for instance, like this, and then any rich text, which is stored as HTML or already. You would leverage this set HTML directive within Astro in order to output the markup from the rich text editor. So remember we said before that the pages directory though is responsible for the routing of the application. So this all works very well and good if we've got a home page and that's it. But most websites, I'm sure you'll agree, have more than one page. So what we don't want to do is have to create a Astro file for every single page. That's not going to be sustainable in any way, shape or form. So rather than this indexed Astro file that we've been working with so far, we're going to replace it with this strange yet elegant syntax. Now this is known in Astro as a multi-level dynamic route. And there's two important things I want to call out about this strange syntax. Firstly, there's the three dots at the start there. Now those signify that it's a multi-level dynamic route and has depth to its URL resolution or its URL setting. If you didn't have those, it would be known as a single level dynamic route and it would just operate across one URL tier. Useful for if you've got like a blog and then an article and it stops there. But here we want to essentially defer all of the URL setting to Umbraco. The second thing to call out is actually the name of it here. I've called it path. Now this is actually a convention. You can call it whatever you want, but the convention is whatever you name the file here is going to be the same name as a parameter that we will set within the file itself to set the URL. Lots of the Astro community out there call it slug, or sometimes I've seen URL. I personally prefer path. Maybe that's an Umbraco thing, I'm not sure. And slug just sounds a bit weird to me. Anyway, so with this multi-level dynamic route, we're essentially, as I said, going to defer all of the URL setting to Umbraco. We want that to control what the URLs are. So just as before, let's open this multi-level dynamic route. So it's just an Astro file. So the syntax the same there with the triple dash, but the multi-level dynamic route is going to expect us to set a function called getStaticPaths. So it's going to expect to find that in there. GetStaticPaths expects us to return an array of objects that Astro can understand and turn into page objects. So how can we do this with Umbraco and the Content Delivery API? Well, just as before, we're going to do a good old-fashioned fetch request, this time to the endpoint to get multiple items back, the query endpoint. For simplicity here, I am just taking 100 at the end of that. In reality, there's lots of different ways to query it. It's also paginated with a skip take pagination. In a real world situation, you want to manage that in the most robust way possible. Once we've got the data back, just as before, we can await that and get our JSON data. I've assigned it to a variable called pages this time, because this is going to be a collection of items that have come back from Umbraco. What we want to do now is iterate across those pages, that resulting JSON, and convert it into something that Astro will understand. So we're going to map with JavaScript over those items, and we're going to do two things. Firstly, we're going to set the URL for that page. Now this is where the convention comes in. So we named the file path. We're going to set a parameter path to page.root.path, which in the Content Delivery API's response is where the URL would be stored. We then want to pass it some data in order to work with in the page itself. Now here, I'm actually going to pass it everything. I'm going to create a property called model, and I'm going to pass it the whole page object because we want to work with as much as possible, really. Ultimately, it's going to be generated as a static asset anyway, and you'll see that we can actually pull things out like the content type and make use of those as well as we go through. So let's just move that up a second. So we've got our getStaticPaths function. What we're going to do then is deconstruct to get access to that model. Now, if you've done JavaScript development before in Next or something, you'll be familiar with deconstructing. Essentially, you do this in all Astro files to get access to the properties that have been passed in or set up even. So here we're going to deconstruct to get access to model. And then just as before, we're going to output within our layout and output our properties. But you might be thinking, well, this is now operating over multiple pages. Not all of my pages have the same properties. They all have different layouts. So how can we manage that? But we can still leverage this multi-level dynamic route as our entry for the application. But instead of outputting the properties directly, because we've passed it everything, we can come up with a strategy and interrogate the content type. So we're going to check what the content type is and then do something with that. So here in this instance, let's have a strategy that renders a home page component for that content type. And I stress the word component there because that will not live in the pages directory, weirdly, because the pages directory has this influence over URL structure and we don't want to muddy the water there. So we'll live in the components directory and we're going to create a subdirectory called pages. You could store it however you see fit, but that's kind of what I do with Astro page components. And then if you can imagine a simple site, might have a home page, generic page, which is really simple, and then a component page, which could have block list, block grid, etc. We can then extend our strategy to render the correct component page component, depending on the content type. So remember I said before that the content delivery API, it returns lots and lots of data. Honestly, if you've got a really big Umbraco site, the amount you get back from there. And when you're working with two systems which are not native bedfellows and natively connected, you're trying to get everything spelt right, work out what the other developers have called properties, and you're picking through Postman requests, and it's guaranteed to blow your mind. But what if there was a better way of working with these two systems together that can make a developer's life much easier and allow us to have a more organized bakery for our Astro development? Unfortunately, there is. And this next little section is not Astro specific. So if you are working with Next or stuff like that with Umbraco, this will also apply to that. And that's essentially leveraging TypeScript. Now, I'm historically an Umbraco developer, but I've spent the last couple of years very deep in Next.js and sort of the front end world, and grown to love it and hate it at the same time. But once you've got familiar with TypeScript, I guarantee you'll never go back. How did we ever work before it? So if you're not familiar with TypeScript, essentially it's a way of bringing strongly typed behavior to JavaScript and acts as a layer on top of JavaScript. It's actually set up in Astro by default. So there's no additional configuration when you're working with Astro, which is great. The two most important things it does is firstly catching errors. So it'll catch errors at build time instead of runtime. So hopefully on the developer's machine, as opposed to eventually 6 months later on the live environment and no one can remember how to fix it. But more importantly here for me is when working with these large data sets, is it brings IntelliSense autocomplete to your editor. And that makes the developer's life much, much easier. It makes for a better developer experience overall until then you realize, actually, now I have to manage TypeScript definitions on top of everything else. And for something like Umbraco, that's a lot more than's on screen there. You have to manage TypeScript definitions for everything that could possibly come back from the CMS. And speaking from experience, it's guaranteed to make you very upset indeed. And it's a maintenance nightmare whenever there's an update. I've been there. So what if there was a better way of working with TypeScript? What if there's a way we can point our machine at some sort of specification and get it to generate all of the types on disk for us, almost like Umbraco Models Builder, but for TypeScript? And it turns out we can do just that. And the specification I'm talking about here is the OpenAPI specification that you can get from using things like Swagger. So if you're not familiar with that, essentially it's a way of detailing the features and functionality of an API, importantly here, in a way that's readable and understandable by humans and also by machines. So as humans, we can go to within Umbraco, we do get it out of the box with Umbraco. We can go to /Umbraco/Swagger and get a flavor of the API. We can test it out in the browser. It's almost like it's documentation, super useful. But there's also a JSON variant of this, which we can point something at and get it to hopefully generate TypeScript definitions for us. And before we talk about what that is, there's a slight issue with the current version of Umbraco. And that's that by default, out of the box, it doesn't give a fully fleshed out Swagger OpenAPI specification. You only get what you get out of the box from Umbraco. So any custom content types, custom data types at the moment are not included within that spec, which is often a lot. So, but as always in the Umbraco community, there's always someone to step up and fix any problem. So a big shout out to Laura Neto and Victor Rodriguez for creating this, I'd say, essential package at the moment for working with Umbraco in a headless way with a sort of native install. And that's the Delivery API Extensions package. This does two things. Firstly, again, helps us humans out by introducing a content app, that little API thing in the top right there. Now that for any node in Umbraco will allow you to explore the response from the API, which is really nice and easy. Don't need Postman and stuff like that just to get a flavor of it. But more importantly for here is it extends the OpenAPI specification. So we've now got a fully fleshed out spec for anything custom. So any custom data types, custom content types are all in there. I'm sure it won't be long before this is eventually consumed into core. I've not heard anything on that, but it seems it would seem daft not to be. So now what we can do, we've got the spec, we can point something at it. So the thing in question is nothing magical, it's just an NPM package. There's a few out there that can do this. So essentially you point the NPM package at a spec and get it to generate the TypeScript definitions. The one I'll recommend here is provided by Hey API, and I'm reliably informed that's the one they use at Umbraco HQ, which is the one I'm recommending here. So you'd install that just as you would install any NPM package. How I would recommend using it is then creating a script within your package JSON. For instance, I've created one called generate here, which will then call the NPM module. And you want to pass it some arguments. One is the input, which is the URL for the Swagger definition, and then an output, which is a directory on disk where you want it to generate stuff. Now you could run this on your local machines, or you could have it in CI/CD. You'd want to work out how best to integrate that into your workflows. So that will generate all of the TypeScript definitions for us that would come back from Umbraco, which is honestly a hell of a lot, and there would be a nightmare to manage individually. Not only that though, it also will create some services, some strongly typed services for us to use within our Astro files or other meta frameworks like content service, meta service. And that means we don't have to do fetch requests anymore. We can strongly, using strongly typed services, interact with the content delivery API. So it feels more like it's all integrated as one system, which is fantastic. And all this, in my opinion, really it empowers us developers then, once we've got this set up, to more robustly and more confidently really work our way through more complex scenarios which often come up. So we'll take a whistle-stop tour now of how we can do something a little bit more advanced with this setup. So imagine we've got block grid. So block grid on the surface may feel like something that's a bit more complex to integrate into something like Astro. It might take a bit of time. But once we have TypeScript powering our journey, we can get up and running in no time at all for a simple grid. So let's take a look at how we can do that. So let's remind ourselves of what files we're going to use. So within our components directory, we're going to leverage that component page component. So that's going to be our the thing we're going to leverage here. And then within our blocks, a block subdirectory of components, we may have a block grid renderer at the top there, and then a suite of blocks. And then for simplicity here, rich text image, quote, list would go on in reality. So just to orient ourselves here, let's return to the start, the entry for the application, the multi-level dynamic route. That's going to be the entry. In this instance, we're going to assume it's going to be a content type of component page. So we're going to render the component page component. So within here, you'll see something slightly different now. We're actually going to import some types from our generated TypeScript definitions. So here we're component page content. So this idea of importing things is obviously familiar with you if you're a C# developer in .NET and also JavaScript as well. It's quite a common practice. So we'll import that at the top there. Then what we want to do is create an interface which is going to tell Astro that the property coming in called model is going to be of type component page content. So we do that. Then we're going to import our block grid renderer. And then just as before, we're going to deconstruct so we get access to our model. But this time, because the TypeScript knows what type it is, we're going to have IntelliSense to be able to work with. So here, we're going to use our block grid renderer, and we're going to pass it a property called grid, and we're going to pass it model.properties.grid, which in reality would have IntelliSense on that. So if grid had been named something quite esoteric and the developer had gone a bit left field, we might be able to find it a bit easier. And also if it's a complex word that's often people spell wrong, we're going to get the right spelling. And if we do anything wrong in there, we'll do a big red underline and we'll know something's wrong straight off the bat. Within our block grid renderer now, we're going to see it's getting slightly more complex. We're going to import some more types from our generated TypeScript. Now, these two in particular would be an absolute pain to create manually because there's quite a lot going on within them, but we don't need to really bother about looking at that implementation. It just works. So we import those and we're going to leverage those below. Then we'll import our suite of blocks, whatever we're going to be using in this particular application, rich text, image, and quote. Then an interface again. So the interface is now telling it the grid property coming in is going to be of type API block grid model. Deconstruct as before. Then just before we use that, I'm going to create a rudimentary, but it does the trick for what we need here, component map. What we're going to do essentially is interrogate the content type of the block and then render the correct block it. So below, we'll create a wrapper div. Here I'm using Tailwind classes, but use whichever front-end framework you desire. We're then going to map across our items from grid, and this is where we're going to use that component map and then pull out, based on its component type, the block, and then render that below. And then this would continue. So we're then within each block, we'd continue to use the TypeScript definitions. What we could do then is call upon the column span from the block grid and then apply the Tailwind class to get the correct width for that grid. And we can get up and running in no time at all. Bellissima, which is a bit of an Umbraco joke, but I think it's got a bit old hat now. I don't think anyone remembers what Bellissima is. But yeah, it works really nicely and you can get up and running with a simple grid structure in no time at all. So imagine now we've got our simple site and we're happy with it and we would like to host it somewhere. So where can we host an Astro site? Well, because in its static site generation mode, it will just build to static assets. It can live on any old server, really, just like the good old days. But I would recommend you explore some of the many cloud hosting offerings that are out there. Here's some that I would recommend. One is Vercel, which at the moment I'm using daily, and it's fantastic. It's actually provided by Next.js, but weirdly is also the official hosting provider for Astro. You'd think they would be combative, but they're actually, it's really healthy, I think, for the ecosystem to have different projects going in different directions. They all learn off each other, and it's really great that they're sort of so open about sharing stuff. So Vercel's fantastic. Cloud hosting provider. I'd recommend exploring those. You get loads out of the box, lots of CI/CD. It's really easy to get up and running in no time at all. Netlify, I came from a bit more of a Jekyll than Gatsby background with static site generation, and Netlify is very affiliated with Gatsby, and I used it for a good while. So I would also recommend Netlify as a thing to explore. Yeah, it's like an alternative to Vercel, really. Cloudflare Pages is another interesting one. So I don't have any sites hosted on there in Astro, but I know there are members of the Umbraco community which have and have had great experience with it. And there's a few blogs in the community for Cloudflare Pages and hosting Astro with the Content Delivery API. So another one worth exploring. And for those of you who, we're predominantly .NET if we're an Umbraco normally. So quite often with that, we might be embedded in Azure also. So if you would like to explore this, but don't really want to bring in another provider like Vercel, then Azure Static Web Apps is also a great solution for hosting things like Astro. A word of advice, though, is you do not get anywhere near the amount out of the box with Azure Static Web Apps. All of the regeneration of the site, you need to kind of do yourself with either Azure pipelines or GitHub Actions, those sort of things. In some scenarios, though, you might prefer to have the control over it, but it's definitely worth exploring that too. So this is a CMS-powered static site. So how can we keep our content fresh when people are clicking that big green button and saving and publishing? Well, for that, we can leverage the power of webhooks. Now, these days in Umbraco, we get a lot out of the box, and we're very lucky. And webhooks is something that's provided out of the box with Umbraco these days. And essentially, I'm sure you're all familiar with them, but a way of linking together two systems which aren't connected via HTTP events, essentially. So we can leverage the power of that to tell Astro basically to regenerate when our content has been published or things have happened with it. So webhooks in Umbraco, we can actually get to those in the settings section. So in settings section on the tree, go down to webhooks, and there you can explore webhooks, and you can integrate with many different systems which work that way. For an example here, imagine we'd hosted on Vercel, and we want to tell Vercel to regenerate, redeploy when things have happened. So in simple terms, when a node has been published, unpublished, or deleted. When that webhook fires off, then Vercel will go through its generation cycle, and we'll have a nice fresh content at the end of that. However, there is a build time involved. Now, we may be used to clicking the publish button and things being instantly available. In this setup, there is a build time. There's obviously the delay in requests going across between our server and Vercel, and then the generation of the site, which can take, for sort of smaller to medium sites, can be like just over a minute, I would say. But obviously that depends on many factors. It's a cloud service, depends how busy things are or how much you're paying. But there's definitely a time involved. My experience with clients is if it's not instantly available, if there's even like 10 seconds for a wait, there's a conversation to be had because they don't know what to do. So it's worth noting that the trade-off there is a build time involved. Another thing to consider is publish volume. Now, if you have a CMS with lots and lots of editors, you may have things being published left, right, and center. And what you don't want in this situation is every time someone's publishing, if it's happened multiple times, an hour or even a minute, is multiple requests going off to Vercel. It's constantly going to be regenerating. And if looking at static site generation as a sort of green initiative in order to reduce carbon for a website, you may just be shifting the problem. We're going to be having build after build going, which might be worse than the site just serving dynamic content. So it's important to consider that. If you do have a busy CMS, then maybe an alternative to webhooks is worth exploring. Something like could be a queuing system. So you're batching stuff up and you're doing them, on a timed basis, but worth considering. So yeah, we're getting towards the end of the presentation. It seems to have gone really fast to that one for me today. So what have we covered today? Well, we looked at Astro. So we've discussed what Astro is and how we can get up and running from a really basic Hello World example all the way through to integrating the Umbraco content delivery API for that static site that is CMS powered. We looked at TypeScript. I think this, if you take anything away from today, if you're not working with Astro in particular, if you're working with Next and you're not working this way, this is a game changer, especially with the content delivery API. So how TypeScript can be generated to make your life much, much easier when working with the separate systems. And also those hosting providers. I think if you're starting with any, Vercel is the most obvious one to explore initially. Like I said, if you're embedded in Azure, take a look at Azure Static Web Apps. That's what I've used to very cheaply host stuff as well. So in my opinion, Astro and Umbraco, there's been lots of buzz around these two things over the last year. I know Richard's on the call has also been involved with this. And like in my opinion, they make a fantastic headless partners together, helping us embrace the principle of bake, don't fry. Yeah, quick touch upon, and Richard, I didn't expect you were going to join this, but there's Rich in the top left there. Big shout out to the community of bloggers and people helping with Astro in the Umbraco community over the last year. So much so that me and Rich and Rick were involved in writing some documentation for the Astro docs. And we actually got that into the Astro documentation on how to integrate Astro with Umbraco, which was a nice sort of community activity last year. And there it is. I'm sure there's at some point we can get that updated, Rich, as well, right? But yeah, it was fantastic to see the community come together. And I felt really lucky to sort of present this at Code Garden last year. Yeah, it was great. Yeah, so my name's Adam Prendergast, Technical Director at Absurd in Manchester in the UK. You can find me on those socials, but thank you so much for listening so attentively today. Any questions? I do have some more cake as well if there's time.
Yeah, it's very nice one. Oh, there is a question. Let me check. It's a short. A silly question, but does Umbraco have blob storage for images and videos, or we require to use something like S3 store URL in Umbraco?
Here's a good question. It's come up a few times, images. Images need, the way I work with it is have Umbraco set up in Azure with blob storage, and then serve your images just as you would via CDN through that blob storage. Crops is an interesting one with images though, dynamic crops, which work quite nicely within an Umbraco native solution, which also work on a query string from the front end. What a few of us that are working with this are interested in is, can we switch off the CMS and the site still works? And at the moment, the way crops are dynamically created wouldn't work because you'd be switching off the backend server. However, I think Astro, where are we up to? The next version of Astro, I think it's on 5 now. It's an experimental feature around dynamic caching, dynamic cropping of images on the edge. So that would be interesting, because ultimately my whole interest in this is how can I host Umbraco for the cheapest? mainly for pet projects and stuff where I'm doing things for friends and they don't have much money, because Umbraco traditionally has always been a bit more expensive to host. And if I can switch the CMS off, the whole backend off, would be beautiful. And then just have it spin up now and again for things. Obviously for more enterprise level things, you wouldn't want to do that. But yeah, but to answer the question, yeah, blob storage generally, and ideally a CDN in front of that too. Nice one.
Thank you, Shanak. Anyone else, guys? So Adam, like, what do you recommend? Like, yes, we do have multiple frameworks like Svelte, Astro, Next.js. Like, what is the main agent or mechanism behind the Astro that the communication? Yeah.
might feel like I primed you with that, Nikhil, because it might lead me on to this, which is interesting. So this, when I did this for Code Garden, you have stringent times. They can be half an hour. So I had to chuck this out of the original presentation. One of the things what makes Astro super interesting is it's different in another way to other meta frameworks in that it's static by default, which I touched on. So everything comes down as just HTML, but it's framework agnostic in terms of front end framework. So you can actually use things called islands, and these islands in there can be any framework. So you can segment areas of your application to be, say, a React component or a Vue component. So that could be either or of those. Weirdly, you can also mix and match. So you could have one component to React, another component that's Svelte. Now, why would you do that? I don't know. One thing I thought was it also works with more super modern, shall I say, or more frameworks which potentially haven't got traction yet, but are meant to be much faster, like things like Quick. And there's one called Solid. There's more. It works with those two. So it could be that you want your team to experiment in a very small fashion with one of those frameworks, but actually get it to production as a little widget. So that could be a thing. So that's where it stands out, is that Next.js is all React. Nuxt is the Vue variant. A Svelte kit, is it? Is the Svelte one? I've never actually used Svelte before. But yeah, I think it all comes down, as anything in this world, is it depends on the problem and also on skill set and how comfortable your developers are in working. What I'm not suggesting is if you've got a project coming up and you're pure Umbraco developers, is stick to what you know for things that are going to be bringing in the money. But if you've got some front end developers that want to try new things, is looking for an opportunity to leverage that. Things with Astro, though, because it is static by default, can be definitely part of the conversation of a carbon reduction conversations. Yeah, so there's those things to play into it too.
Nice. Yeah. Any more questions, community?
I guess I just had a quick question, honestly, Fred. I'm not to kind of surprise with this. Have you tried with Umbraco 15? Have you done any sort of exploration into Umbraco 15 with this? I think the demos you've been doing were in 14, but I might be wrong. And like, can you see any particular difference or changes that would be expected with 15 at all?
Yeah, do you know what? I've not with 15, but I don't think there's been anything widely changed on the content delivery API, but don't officially quote me on that. So I don't see there being any differences. In my opinion, a lot of those changes in those 14, 15, it's very much on the web component side of things, isn't it? So, which is probably why the content delivery API has probably not been evolved too much yet, because I think a lot of the HQ have been concentrating on that. But do correct me if I'm wrong, Rich.
No, genuinely no experience. I haven't looked into it at all. I was just genuinely curious.
I think there's a few pioneers exploring the newer versions of Umbraco at the moment. We're very much at the moment, as I imagine quite a lot of agencies are, is desperately trying to get everyone onto 13. Which, clients which are still stuck on version 9 and all that business, which are not easy migrations. But that's what we do. Yeah, I think next LTS is version 17, isn't it? So we're looking at the support dates, and I think version 16 is when it starts to overtake 13 in terms of support dates. So it might be then when we start dipping our production eyes on it.
Great, thank you, appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries. Nice one. Don't worry if there's no more questions. Or is there one more?
It's from Abby.
From Abby. Nice one, Abby. Yeah, no, cool. I suppose if there's no more questions, Nick, I'll leave you to wrap it up. But yeah, it's been a really nice privilege actually to present to you all. So hopefully I
Thank you.
can be back at some point.
Sure.
I would
Thank you
love
so
to come
much,
over
Adam,
as well. I'd
Yeah,
love to come
thank you
over.
so
Need
much,
to try the
Adam.
Nanka tie.
You will have it in the next Code Garden. When we'll meet, you will have a special Nanka tie from India.
Oh, please. That will make my day.
Thank you, Adam, for your time and sharing the most experienced knowledge on the Astro and the content delivery API. It's insightful.
Yeah, definitely. And sometimes I know it's hard to ask questions on these things or think of something. You can get me on LinkedIn or anything. I'm always open to chatting or Discord. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, then thank you so much once again and see you at Code Garden 2025.
Perfect. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, bye. Thank you.
See you later.